Hello everyone and welcome to your library at home. My name is Rebecca. I'm part of the public programs team here at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Gadigal land, the traditional custodians of this land, on which knowledge has been exchanged for millennia. We also celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal culture and language across New South Wales, and I take this opportunity to pay my respects to elders past, present, and certainly emerging. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Australians who may be joining us online today. I am very pleased to be welcoming you online to our very first in a new series that has been initiated by the State Library of New South Wales. On the first Thursday of every month during the season of winter, I'd like you to join us online for The Science of Us, a program that brings together scientists, researchers, authors, and academics on topics to help us understand the troubling human behaviour through the prism of science. This program is being run in partnership with Inspiring Australia, and we're excited to have Dr. Melissa Norberg back at the State Library to present today on conquering anxiety and fear. Melissa will have time to take questions at the conclusion of the talk. I encourage you all to use the Q&A feature of Zoom to type in your questions for Melissa that you may have at any stage through the talk. I will be back online to facilitate that Q&A with Melissa at the conclusion of her presentation. Before we hear from Melissa, I would like to now introduce to your screens the manager of Inspiring Australia, Jackie Randles. Thanks, Jackie.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to any elders with us today, past, present and emerging. I'm so thrilled to be co-hosting this series with the State Library of New South Wales. And I really want to thank Rebecca and her library colleagues for their support. There's so much science behind how we think, feel and act. And as the manager for Inspiring Australia, my job is to set up opportunities for research scientists to connect with the broader community at welcoming events like this one. And there's nowhere better than a library than to reach out to people with science information. Inspiring Australia's mission is to promote the relevance of scientific research and encourage Australians to value the contributions of researchers to future prosperity and well-being. And today's topic is incredibly apt given the uncertainty of our times. And like many others, I've been extremely anxious and afraid at various times over the past 18 months, probably more so than ever. I've been scared to see fires and floods ravage our country and similar incidents play out across the globe as the impacts of climate change intensify. I've been anxious about the pandemic. I wonder when and if it will end. And I worry about my aging mother living alone in Melbourne and the social isolation many of us experience in lockdown, particularly those living alone. And for anyone here from Melbourne, I wish you all the best for the current lockdown and hope it doesn't last for too much longer. As a parent, I've been terrified by the emotional highs and lows experienced by my teenage son. And at work, I've been anxious about the future of my job. This uncertainty is shared by an increasing number of people. But sometimes I'm anxious about nothing much at all, and I can feel fearful and not understand why. So what do you do if you're easily anxious and can get gripped with acute fear and a sense of dread, even about small things that may not logically pose much of a threat? Well, joining us to discuss this question is Professor Melissa Norberg, an expert on anxiety disorders. I'm delighted that Melissa's here to launch our Science of Us series. And she's going to tell us how we can respond to anxiety and fear when they arise. Melissa is Deputy Director at the Centre for Emotional Health at Macquarie University. She's also the National President of the Australian Association for Cognitive and Behaviour Therapy. Her research examines psychological factors that underpin anxiety disorders. And importantly, she identifies strategies that can help us overcome these burdensome conditions. But most of all, Melissa is an empathetic and skilled science communicator as well. So it's great that she's here today. So Melissa, I'll now hand over to you and thank you again for sharing your research knowledge with us. And I, for one, really look forward to learning how science might be able to help me conquer anxiety and fear. Thanks, Melissa, and over to you.
Thank you, Jackie, for that lovely opening. I'm really honored to be asked to come back and present for the State Library. And I really appreciate you being so open about your own personal experiences. Today, I'm going to be focusing on how to deal with an anxiety disorder. And I think it's really necessary to point out that the skills I'm going to be talking about can help different levels of anxiety. It doesn't need to just be at the point where it qualifies for a disorder. So any of you who are feeling a bit anxious day in and day out, but maybe it's not so pervasive that it's really impacting your life functioning, that you'll still get some helpful tricks from today's presentation. So what I'll do right now is start to share my screen with you. Okay. So just to reiterate, today I'm going to be talking about how to conquer your anxiety and fear. And I think it's important to give you a glimpse into why I'm even interested in researching and treating anxiety. And I think it might help to give you a glimpse into where I'm from. So I was born and raised in Kimball, Nebraska. It's a small rural town, and its highlights include that you can buy a home for less than $100,000. For those of you joining us from Australia today, you probably weren't even aware that a house could be that low priced. And if that's not as fantastic enough to excite you about Kimball, I can also tell you that it has 2 schools, 2 parks, 1 public pool, its very own newspaper, and the Transcontinental Highway, Interstate 80, runs directly through the town. But none of those amazing things really compare to my personal favorite. Kimball has the absolute best Dairy Queen in the entire United States. And when I was growing up there, one of my friends, her parents own the Dairy Queen, and she told me the secret to their soft serve ice cream. She said it was all about adding a little bit extra oxygen to it. Now, I'm sure that's really top secret, so please, can you keep this secret for me? Now, the not so great thing about growing up in Kimball is growing up in this house. This house does not have a basement. And that's important because Kimball is located within Tornado Alley. Every year, Nebraska experiences on average 42 tornadoes. In some years, it's as many as 110. So one day when I was maybe around 13 years old, my parents left me at home to babysit my brother and sister while they did things on the farm. And I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to practice dealing with a tornado. Now, when you don't have a basement, the next best thing is to go into a small interior room within your home. So something like a bathroom or a closet. I decided that we should hide in our tiny coat and shoe closet. So the 3 of us get inside, shut the door, and once we're inside, come to find out the door doesn't open from the inside. So over the next few hours, I became extremely fearful that we were all going to suffocate to death. I started to try and break down the door to get us out, but then I would stop because I would then become worried that I was going to get in trouble for breaking our door. But then I would feel fearful again about my immediate threatening life, that I wasn't going to live any longer from a lack of oxygen, and I'd start crawling at the door again. And then I'd stop, being afraid I was going to get grounded. And so what seemed like many, many hours, I just vacillated back and forth between fearing for my immediate life and worrying about the future. And I'm sure you can all relate to this experience. Okay, maybe not the part about locking your siblings up in a closet and terrifying them, but the part about feeling extremely fearful and anxious. It's normal to feel anxiety. It's protective. These emotions help us. If a tornado were to hit our home, They would mobilize us to action so that we could run into that closet and hopefully live another day. Many people talk about anxiety and fear as if they're the same thing. I even do it myself. But actually, these two emotions are slightly different. Fear isn't about immediate threat, whereas anxiety is about a future threat. Both anxiety and fear involve thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. When we worry about the future, we typically don't feel very aroused. Instead, we all feel a lot of muscle tension and maybe some stomach distress. On the other hand, when we experience fear, we think about our impending death, we sweat, we tremble, and our heart races. Our long-term survival functions, like our digestive tract, they shut down, and we are mobilized to escape the situation. And as stated, these are normal processes that help to protect us. But some of us feel anxiety and fear when a threat doesn't really exist. When we feel these emotions day in and day out, and they interfere with our life functioning, we call it an anxiety disorder. These 10 anxiety disorders share similar symptoms. They differ is in what is feared. A kid who meets criteria for separation anxiety disorder fears being away from their caregivers, whereas an adult who meets criteria for social anxiety disorder, they fear being judged by other people. In both cases, when individuals are confronted by their feared situations, they experience extreme emotions. 1 in 4 Australians will suffer from at least one of these anxiety disorders at some point in their life. You might be asking yourself, if anxiety and fear are normal and protective, then why do some people experience problematic anxiety and fear? Part of the answer has to do with genetics. The other part has to do with our learning history. Just like with Pavlov's dogs, we humans can acquire a physiological response when one is not required. Pavlov trained his dogs to salivate in response to a ringing bell. The first time he rang the bell, the dogs did not salivate. At this point, the bell is called a neutral stimulus. At birth, it means nothing to us. He then paired this neutral stimulus with food. Food is biologically significant. It causes us to salivate. This is an instinct we're born with. We don't have to learn it. And so when he paired the bell with the food, the dog salivated simply because the food was present. But then what Pavlov did is he repeatedly paired the bell and the food together. And after he did this multiple times, he then presented the ringing bell on its own, and the dog salivated. We call this a conditioned response. By pairing the bell with the food, the dogs learned, hey, the bell predicts food. And so the bell acquired the ability to elicit salivation. And by doing so, the bell, which was a neutral stimulus at birth, turns into a conditioned stimulus capable of eliciting a conditioned response, simply from its association with food. Now, this study design has been repeated numerous times with humans using different stimuli, such as pictures of spiders, snakes, faces, flowers, and geometric shapes. And we pair them with a mild electric shock. And sure enough, no matter what we use, we can train humans to fear stimuli that don't actually pose any harm. Interestingly, researchers have found that we don't even have to pair them with actual electric shock. We can simply just tell people, hey, when you see this flower, I'm going to shock you, but not actually do it. And people will elicit a fear reaction to the flower. Research has also shown that we can simply watch it happen to somebody else. So we can watch them look at a flower, them receive a mild electric shock, and sure enough, we'll become fearful of the flower. So this research has taught us that we can acquire fear responses through our own direct learning by being told about possible danger and by watching something aversive happen to somebody else. So once this pairing happens, if we misinterpret our reaction to these conditioned stimuli as signaling actual threat, we'll experience an even further increase in our anxiety. If we then attempt to avoid and escape this imagined threat, such as, say, washing our hands after we interpret an anxious reaction to shaking someone's hand, meaning we must be capable of catching a dreaded disease from this person, well, we'll experience a reduction in our anxiety. But what happens in the long term is we reinforce this belief that shaking hands is dangerous. And so the next time we shake hands with someone, we'll be inclined to think that it signals danger. We'll be encouraged to wash our hands to remove that danger and to reduce our anxiety. And if we keep doing this, we then might stop shaking people's hands. And so this process explains why as infants, we're not born to fear contamination. We don't care where our food comes from. We don't care if our parents give it to us or if we see it on the floor or even in the dog's food dish. We also don't care if our food touches our feet or if our feet touches our food. We eat it, and we are happy to do so. By misinterpreting our cues as dangerous and by repeatedly engaging in avoidance behaviors to protect ourselves from these imagined threats, we can go from being that carefree baby to believing that we need to scrub our floors by hand with a brush every single day. Importantly, our theoretical models for anxiety disorders guide us in how to treat an anxiety disorder. In order to break this repetitive cycle, we need to change our thoughts and change our behavior. This is essentially what all cognitive behavioral treatments aim to do. The treatment that I specialize in is one form of cognitive behavioral therapy called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is one of the most effective treatments for an anxiety disorder. Exposure therapy requires people to confront what they fear in the absence of any actual harm. Exposure therapy doesn't have people confront actually dangerous situations. We only use it to help people challenge the unhelpful associations between conditioned stimuli and conditioned responses. By having people confront their fears in the absence of any danger, a person's expectancy for harm is violated. In other words, they no longer believe that the bell predicts food, that a geometric shape predicts electric shock, or that shaking someone's hands means catching a dangerous disease. And when they no longer expect harm to occur, they experience a reduction in their anxiety and fear. We call this process fear extinction. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to show you how to extinguish your acquired fears based on years of scientific research. I'm going to teach you everything that needs to be done in order to deliver gold standard exposure therapy. If you're a clinician and if you're a consumer, you're going to know exactly what your therapist should be asking you to do. So in order to make all of you fear and anxiety conquerors, I need you first to imagine that you're terrified of spiders. I want you to imagine that you are someone who refuses to go into a room without a can of Mortein if there's a spider in it. Okay, are you all spider phobics right now? Excellent. Let's get started. So first, I need you to figure out what you're afraid of so that we can develop appropriate activities to put on our exposure fear hierarchy to help you conquer your spider fear. But it's not always clear what people are afraid of. We often don't know what we're afraid of because we react with avoidance so quickly and so often that we never actually give ourselves the chance to think about what makes us scared. One of the best ways to figure out what makes us scared is to put ourselves in those fearful situations and to not let ourselves escape. So you're probably too scared to put a spider on yourselves right now. So I want you just to get as close to one as you can. So for today's purposes, maybe just envision that you are in a room and there's a spider in it and it's locked in a cage, and try to imagine yourself getting as close to that cage as you can. And think about putting your hand in that cage. What are you afraid of? You might think that people are afraid of spiders because they're going to get bitten and die. So you might be surprised to learn that only 20% of people who are afraid of spiders are actually afraid of getting bitten and dying from that bite. What most people actually fear is that a spider is going to purposely aim at them, cause them to panic, and then they will die or go crazy from that panic. In order to determine your threat expectancies, you need to think about, what is the spider going to do to you if it gets out of the cage? What will be the outcome? Although you may get scared from seeing it in the cage, I doubt that your underlying fear has anything to do with the spider being in the cage. So what if it gets out? What if it gets on you? Where will it go? And what will it do when it's there? Perhaps what you ultimately fear is that a spider will crawl on you, get under your shirt, and you won't be able to get it off of you. And this will cause you to die and experience never-ending panic. So now that you know what a spider signals to you, we're going to aim to develop a new non-threat expectancy during exposure therapy that counters this original belief. So right now you have the belief spider equals getting on my shirt and I won't be able to get it out and it's going to cause never-ending panic, which will cause me to die. So now I want to create a new association that spider predicts nothing bad will happen. So to do this, our next step is to develop a fear hierarchy. We need to design activities that challenge our threat expectancies. So likely you're too scared to put the spider under your shirt right now, so we'll start with some easier stuff, just to build up your tolerance and your self-efficacy. In other words, I want to give you confidence that you can carry out the really hard stuff where the real learning is going to occur. So this might be stuff like standing next to the spider in the closed glass cage. The next activity on your hierarchy might be sliding open the ceiling on the cage a little bit. And then it might be taking the top off completely. The next step might be putting a glove on and sticking your hand halfway into the cage. Then it might be putting your hand all the way into the cage, and so on and so forth. It's probably a really good point to remind you that exposure therapy doesn't involve you actually putting yourself in harm's way. So the spider in the cage is never going to be a redback or a funnel web spider. Therapy isn't aimed at reducing protective anxiety and fear. Remember, it's only aimed at disrupting those non-helpful associations that end up disrupting your quality of life because avoidance is overtaken your day-to-day living. And so when you're engaging in exposure activities, I'm never going to ask you to do things that are really dangerous. However, there might be some times where I ask you to do things that pose a very improbable danger, but it's possible something could happen. And if that something happens, I'm going to ensure that it's a mild threat. So an example of this is putting in a non-aggressive spider into that cage. Non-aggressive spiders don't attack unless they're attacked first, but it is possible they could bite you. So what I'll ask you to do is never to be aggressive to the spider. I'm going to ask you to be gentle, because the benefits of engaging in this activity far outweigh the risk of being bit by a non-aggressive, non-poisonous spider. The third step is to give up your safety signals and safety behaviors. Safety signals are cues in the environment that indicate safety. A parent may serve as a safety signal for their child. The child may be afraid of the dark and find it difficult to sleep at night. But if mommy crawls in bed, everything may be a-okay. In this instance, mom is a safety signal. Safety behaviors, on the other hand, are the things that we do to make ourselves feel better and to avoid danger. It could be wearing gloves to pick up a dead spider, or it could be keeping a water bottle nearby when you're giving a talk. These safety signals and safety behaviors prevent us from learning that danger does not actually exist. When evil doesn't befall us, we think it's because we wore the gloves or because we had the water nearby. But the dark cannot hurt us. A speech cannot hurt us. We don't actually need our moms or our gloves to protect us in these situations. So figure out what it is or what you do that leads you to feel safe, and then get rid of it. Or don't, if you don't mind sleeping with your mother for the rest of your life. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to step 4, which is to actually engage in the exposure activities on our fear hierarchy. But we just don't grin and bear it when we carry out these activities. We need to carry them out in a way that's actually a helpful learning experience. So every time you conduct an exposure activity on your fear hierarchy, I want you to think about 4 things. So I want you to pay close attention to the negative features of the exposure task. I want you to narrow in on why these features bother you so much. And I want you to ask yourself, can you tolerate your reactions? And then I want you to think about what you're learning from this activity that provides you with information about your worst case scenario. So, when you're sitting in front of this hairy, ugly spider with long needle-like eggs, focus on how anxious it makes you. Think about how you worry that it's going to jump onto you and you're never going to be able to get it off. And if that happens, you're going to have panic and you're going to die. Focus on that. Do not reappraise the situation. In other words, don't tell yourself things to make the activity easier. Don't say to yourself, Melissa would never actually have me do something dangerous. What we want to tell ourselves is that danger is possible because that's when the greatest learning occurs. When we think something bad is going to happen and it doesn't happen, we have an immense learning experience. But if we tell ourselves that nothing bad could happen and nothing bad happens, well, we don't learn very much. So I really want you to focus on what you think could be the worst possible outcome of this situation. So I need you to personally learn that things are okay, rather than convince yourself that things are okay. Now, focus on what you feel and what you think is going to happen. So really focus on your anxiety and fear responses. Does your chest feel tight? Is your heart rate elevated? Are your hands a bit sweaty? Now ask yourself, can you tolerate these emotions? You think that the spider's going to get on you and cause you so much panic that you're going to die. Are you dead yet? Oh, you're not dead? So I guess you can tolerate this situation. You don't need to like it, but what I need you to focus on is you're not dead. And that means you can actually tolerate these symptoms. And now that you've done that, I want you to focus on what this exposure activity is teaching you about that worst case scenario, that spider getting on you, getting under your shirt. What is it teaching you about that particular situation? And once you realize that Melissa's showing you a fake spider over Zoom can't actually teach you anything about that situation, it's time for you to move on to the next activity in your fear hierarchy. And you just keep moving up to the fear hierarchy till you get to the most difficult exposure on the hierarchy. Now, I not only need you to carry out all of the activities on your fear hierarchy, but I need you to do it in multiple different contexts. And that's because research has taught us that fear memories, that association between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, it generalizes to everywhere. If we learn that spiders are bad within our own homes, maybe a parent told us, hey, get away from that spider. Spiders are dangerous in Australia. We can generalize that to every place that we ever go. Unfortunately, fear extinction memories don't seem to work like that. They seem to be confined to the place where we learned it. So if you only confront the spider in your therapist's office, well, then you're probably not gonna have phobia symptoms in your therapist's office. But that's not really helpful. You didn't come to therapy to live your life in your therapist's office. You came to have a better life within your home, within your work, when you're out with your friends. And so you're going to need to carry out these activities in those situations. You're really going to want to target, where does your fear naturally come up, and do the activities in those situations. And as with contexts, fear extinction is also really closely tied to the stimuli that we use during exposure therapy. So if we conduct every exposure activity with a daddy longleg spider, well, then we'll probably learn that we don't need to be afraid of daddy longlegs. But this might not generalize to St. Andrew's cross and various other spiders that we encounter. And so I'm going to ask you to mix it up. I'm going to ask you to carry out your exposure activities with other non-aggressive, non-dangerous spiders. And once you've done that, I want you to mix it up even more. And I want you to do it with multiple different spiders, 2 daddy longlegs, or maybe 1 daddy longlegs and a St. Andrew's cross, and teach you that various different combinations still don't lead to harm. We also know that fear extinction memories tend not to be so resilient over the passage of time. So one way to combat this is to space out our exposure activities. So in other words, you want to train your extinction memory over the passage of time. So first, what I want you to do is really learn that a spider does not predict harm. So I'm going to have you do exposure activities every single day. And once you begin to learn and your anxiety reduces, that you're learning that spiders aren't all that dangerous, well, then I'm going to have you do an exposure activity once a week, and then once a month, then maybe once every 3 months, and once every 6 months. And by doing these spaced out exposure activities that get longer and longer, is we are teaching our brain not to relapse. Now, there's a chance that even though you do all these exposure activities in multiple different contexts, that you will encounter a spider in a situation which you didn't work on. Perhaps you didn't have access to a particular spider, or perhaps you didn't train yourself in a particular context. It's not like we can get on a plane and fly to Peru tomorrow. Luckily, there are some tricks for getting around this. And this is what we call that we need retrieval cues for. So retrieval cues help us bring these fear extinction memories into new places. And so this can be as simple as just reminding ourselves that we did these activities and harm never occurred. So when we do finally get to leave Australia and go hiking in the Amazon jungle, we could just simply get to the jungle, close our eyes, and imagine, remember all those times I encountered spiders in Australia and nothing happened? Well, the same can happen on my hike. Alternatively, we can take a picture of ourselves conquering these spiders in Australia and take that picture with us to the Amazon jungle and look at it periodically while going on our walk. And that can help to bring that fear extinction memory into the new context. So when we do encounter a new spider in this new situation, we'll be less likely to experience relapse. Now, the very last thing I want you to do as part of your fear hierarchy is to engage in overlearning. This means doing something that you are 110% positive is going to end up in your worst case scenario coming true. Now, overlearning usually involves doing things that just don't seem natural, like having a spider on your face. Most people would say, that's just not natural. Nobody needs to do that. I'm not doing it. But as your therapist or your trainer in exposure therapy, I'm going to encourage you to use overlearning. And the reason for that is research has found that people who engage in overlearning have 2 times better outcomes than those who don't. So individuals who are able to put a spider on their face will have greater reductions in their fear beliefs and in their anxiety symptoms than individuals who do not put the spider on their face, because of that mismatch between what they think is going to happen and what actually happens. This is where you get the greatest learning. Because you're 100% positive bad things are going to happen. When they don't, it's a massive learning experience. And who knows, with all this practice, you might become an internet sensation for being the least fearful person in the world. So that concludes my formal presentation for today on how to conquer anxiety and fear. I hope you've learned a lot of helpful strategies. I'm really excited to take any questions that you may have. But before we turn to the question and answer portion of today's talk, I just want to let you all know that I will be speaking at Vivid this year on our attachment to possessions and how it's leading to overconsumption, and to give people some strategies for acquiring and saving fewer possessions so that we have less of an impact on our planet. So I encourage you to follow me on Facebook or Twitter. I'm AnxietyDoc1, and I will keep you updated on my Vivid talk, as well as giving periodic helpful hints on how to deal with anxiety and fear, as well as our attachment to possessions. So thank you so much for attending today. I'll now leave it to Rebecca to lead us on the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a bit hard for me to go through, but as a confessed arachnophobe, we do have a number of questions coming through, but there is a very reoccurring theme. So I'm going to try and bundle these up as best as I can, because a lot of our questions are relating to health-related anxiety disorders and OCD. And obviously during this time of a pandemic where these types of disorders, are we're in unprecedented times. So things that we were once told were safe are now deemed not safe. So how can we best start to, look at these types of disorders and move forward, especially with, ERP therapy being a little bit prohibitive, as well as what we can and can't expose ourselves to during the times like these?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. That's important. So I think it's important to think about this period of time as a context. So we're in the context of COVID. And as I mentioned, that exposure and response prevention, we don't actually have people do anything dangerous. And so what I might not be encouraging right now is to go shake hands with a bunch of strangers that you don't know if they have symptoms, but it would be doing other things that don't pose much danger. So typically people who are really, really frightened about germs, it won't just be other people that trigger those kind of sensations. So it might be doing things within their own homes. So it might be going and eating in the bathroom on the floor and in your own home. So that shouldn't pose any additional danger to sleeping in your bed at home or being in the living room. It's just a bathroom. And so if you can, sit on the floor and eat a sandwich, that can be some ways to get a practice. So it's thinking about what can you do in this context that doesn't actually pose any danger, that can help you to counter any unhelpful beliefs. And then once more people are vaccinated and we have less of a concern with COVID, and if shaking hands is still bothering you and doing other sorts of activities, it's then once it's deemed safe to go out and try those things.
A question here. If you have an anxiety or a fear around something that can legitimately kill you, what are some techniques? Well,
I guess spiders could legitimately kill you. But what's important to know is that no one's died from a spider bite in many, many years. And so it's thinking about the probability of that is so low that it doesn't make sense if day in and day out you're afraid of spiders, or if a benign spider's in your bathroom that you won't go into your spider. So that particular spider doesn't cause you any danger. So it's learning that, yes, it makes sense to be afraid of the funnel web. So we're not going to go roll around in the dirt with the funnel web. But I might ask you to put a St. Andrew's cross on your body at some point because it poses very little danger. So it's thinking about if something that's actually dangerous has generalized so that you're changing your life to situations that don't actually pose danger, it's confronting those non-dangerous situations and learning that they're okay.
A question around social anxiety, looking for examples of overlearning equivalent to conquering those, which would be at the same level, I guess, as putting the spider on your face.
So with social anxiety, it would be, again, thinking about the core fear is negative evaluation. Hang on, I've just done a bit too much talking.
Take your time.
So the core fear there is negative evaluation. So figuring out which contexts really make you afraid. So if speaking to your closest friends don't cause you that much anxiety, that's not going to be overlearning. So it's thinking about, is it giving a presentation at work? Who needs to be there? and asking for opportunities, real life activities at work that would challenge those beliefs. It would be thinking about the costs. So maybe you're afraid that you're going to sweat profusely and then people are going to judge you because you're a very sweaty person. So I would say, well, let's put some water under your armpits and make it noticeable through your shirt that you've been sweating, and go and give that presentation. And see, people may look at you, but you can still give the presentation. Nobody's going to fire you from your job. So your worst case scenario isn't likely to come true, that you can tolerate it. So it's making those costs that you think are the end of the world that usually aren't. It's making those costs kind of come true and seeing that your fears about negative evaluation are completely valid.
And again, a bit of a theme for people who have phobias over blood tests and physical cuts. You know, the whole where people providing symptoms here of feeling giddy, fainting, any suggestions over conquering those types of fears?
So with blood phobias, it's a bit different. Same, you do the exposures, but what's different is when you're doing this exposures, you're going to have to add something that I didn't mention. And so what happens with fainting, usually when we get anxious, we don't faint because it's the opposite of being anxious. It's a decrease in your blood pressure, where being anxious is usually an increase. And so what you're going to want to do is prevent that fainting from happening. So often what you can do is like tense your muscles. So when someone's about to present the needle during the exposure activities, is you're going to tighten up your body to prevent the fainting from happening. And so you'll have to keep muscles tense while engaging in those exposure activities.
We don't have any other questions at the moment that are coming through. So I will just keep an eye on that for the next couple of minutes, because we do have some time. So I do encourage you, if you do have any questions, to put them through. A number of people are asking if this session will be made available online. I can answer that yes, they will. And the entire series of The Science of Us will be recorded and made available on the State Library website and the State Library YouTube channel. There will be some weeks preparation for those to become available, but I do encourage you to keep an eye out there. Again, we're getting another bit of a theme with some last minute questions through around examples of treatments for panic disorders.
Okay, great. Panic disorder involves your internal sensations becoming the conditioned stimuli. So anxiety actually becomes conditioned, becomes a conditioned stimulus for panic, which is fear. And so what happens is we start to have slight changes in our body indicative of anxiety that we misinterpret it as being dangerous, which then increases our anxiety, and then it spirals into a full-blown panic attack. And these often happen in various different contexts. We then might be afraid that we're going to have panic attacks in big open spaces or on public transport. And these situations are going to be hard to get help. It's going to either be hard to get off if we're on the train. We can't just get off whenever we want. So we won't be able to get help. And so with panic disorder, what we're going to need to do is have exposure activities that get us used to our bodily sensations, so we relearn that they're not dangerous. And so it might be spinning in a chair to make ourselves feel dizzy. It might be hyperventilating, so breathing in and out really hard. Could be jogging in place. So doing things that mimic anxiety and get our heart rate up, but then also doing those in particular situations that we might be avoiding, so that we're no longer afraid of taking public transport, that we realize even if we do have these symptoms on a train, they don't kill us, it's okay. And they are less likely to actually spiral into panic attack because we've learned to disassociate. It's not the right word, but break up that association between anxiety and panic.
I just want to make reference to a couple people have asked in relation to how to register for your UTS session. I can advise that there has been a link posted in the answered section of the Q&A. If anyone else is interested, you can follow the URL that's been provided there for that session. We are getting a number of questions through, so I'm going to have to try and get through what we can. A question in relation to, which I think could be related to more than just the specific example that they've given of a medical condition where the condition of fear keeps changing, you know, from cancer to brain tumor to diabetes. Yeah, how to confront those changing fears.
Yeah, I will say this is quite common when I'm helping people with obsessive compulsive disorder. That will see that what they're obsessing about might change over time. And this usually happens because we haven't actually targeted the core belief. And so usually OCD involves a belief of being intolerant of uncertainty. And so it would be different situations that involve uncertainty could pop up and be the focus of interest. And so what needs to happen to kind of prevent that from happening is when we're doing the exposure activities to really focus on what is this teaching us about our ability to deal with uncertainty when there are uncertain situations. How often do they actually turn out to be aversive? And can we tolerate the never knowing part and getting used to that? And so that it's less likely that the theme will change. And then just giving people the skills by doing the exposure activities and realizing, yep, I can do them. I can tolerate my anxiety. And so when something new does pop up, that they can just say, look, this is annoying, but I have the skills. Instead of ritualizing and avoiding, I'm going to go confront this head on and nip it in the bud before it spirals out of control.
I'm just going to finish on one last question before we introduce the next month's topic for the Science of Us. Do you have any opinions on the potential benefits of acceptance and commitment therapy for anxiety disorders?
Oh, I wonder who is asking this question. So just a little bit about me. My PhD was on relational frame theory, which is the theory underlying acceptance and commitment therapy. I think personally for me as a therapist, I wouldn't say that I do ACT, but I definitely, it's a part of who I am in my training. And so I will incorporate certain aspects into it. I think it's been very important for the field because it has taught us that as clinical psychs that we've often been way too focused on reducing symptoms. And so helping people reduce their anxiety and fear, but we forget about the reason they actually care about having anxiety and fear, and that's from having a disrupted quality of life. And so it helps us put the focus back on making sure that we're helping people to actually have better lives. When it comes to treating something with OCD, I'm not so sure that carrying out exposures in the way that ACT recommends is the best way to go. There has been a few studies, and so far none of these studies have shown they're better. I think the reason they may not be better is because they're so focused on quality of life. So they would say, instead of sitting on the floor and eating a sandwich in your bathroom, because that's not real, do something that helps improve your quality of life. So if you're avoiding eating out with friends because you're afraid of germs, then go eat out with friends so that you're targeting that quality of life. But with that, I don't think there's a lot of overlearning. And so I want you to also do the things that don't really make sense. And so that you get that full, I really thought 100% this bad thing was going to happen, and it didn't. So I think that's what's potentially missing. So the long answer is I think maybe a combination is needed to focus on quality of life, but not to drop the overlearning.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us again at the library. It's been wonderful to have you back. Thank you everyone for joining us online. As I mentioned, we're running this series throughout July and August also. We will have some extra talks in August, I did forget to mention, in celebration of National Science Week. You will start to see these events online. I can let you know that registrations are open for our July talk with Jonica Newby on understanding your emotions on climate change. That will be at 11:30 on the 1st of July, again online. Thank you everyone. Thank you Jackie for your time today, for putting us in touch again with Melissa. Thank you Melissa for joining us and for taking the time to present and answer some much needed questions there.
Great, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.